So I've kicked things off with a new project here using the new project command within Visual Studio Code. And the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and start this app up and wait for this to finish. Okay, so that's all loaded in. Just before we start to look at really simple API requests, let's just get rid of everything inside of the home page state and go ahead and bring back our build command here. And I'm just going to return a new app scaffold. And inside of here, we're going to just introduce a really simple app bar. Let's just get rid of this to do as well. And this is just going to be an app bar with a title. And of course, that's just going to be some text. So we should have already learned all of this if you've been following along the Flutter path. So I'm just going to call this API. And sure enough, we have a blank slate to start working with. So this is going to work by having just a body, and we're going to create a center widget inside of here. And the child for this, just for now, is going to be a piece of text. And by the end of this, what we're going to do is say something like, hey, and then call an API and then pull in the name of the currently signed in user. We're not going to be looking at authentication, but this will give you a good idea as to how you can just make really simple API requests, pull the data back, making sure it's decoded from JSON. Most of the time you'll be working with JSON, and then output this on the screen. So the most basic thing that we can possibly do. And then as we gradually get through the course, we'll up things and make them more advanced. Okay, so now that we've got this, let's just take a look at our API. So I've created an API here. This is the URL for it. And all this has is a data structure here. And then inside of this object, we have a name with my name. So that is what we want to call. That's the data that we want to grab, and that's the data that we want to replace inside of here. It doesn't matter what you're using to build your API. We just want to keep this really simple. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do in order to make HTTP requests is pull in the Dart HTTP package. So you can read about this here, and I'll leave a link for this in the course links. But the first thing we're going to do is just come over to the installation section and grab the HTTP dependency and the current version. Now, we haven't looked at where to place these yet. This will be over in your pubspec.yaml file. You'll see a list of all of your dependencies here. This is in the YAML format. So if you've not worked with this, we just basically work with indentation here, and that's how that works. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this in. And once I save this, you'll notice that the package will automatically be pulled in. If that's successful, it now means that you've got that package installed in your project. So before we go on, the next thing we really need to speak about are futures. There's a type in Dart called a future. Essentially, this is like a promise within JavaScript. So it's something that will happen in the future. We can have an asynchronous function here. We wait for something to happen, and then we return some data, and we return a future so we can then wait for this request to finish. And this will start to come together if this doesn't make too much sense. So what we want to do inside of this future, and let's just keep this really simple for now. I'm going to call this fetch user. Inside of here, we're going to have an asynchronous operation. That means that something is going to happen. We're going to wait for something to finish. Then we're going to do something with that data. Now, the thing that we need to wait for is the actual API request. So we perform the API request inside of here. Then what we do is we take the response from the HTTP request or the API request, and we decode it. So we JSON decode it. Most of the time you're going to be working with JSON. I'm not going to cover anything else, but we're going to decode this really, really simply and return it from here. And that will return to us a future that we can then do something with. So let's take a look at how we use the HTTP package that we've pulled in to grab this response. So I'm going to create a variable in here called response, and I'm going to assign this, and I'm going to use a wait in here to wait for this request to finish. And I'm going to use the new HTTP package that we've pulled in, and I'm going to paste in a URL inside of here, which will make the request to. So in order to pull this package in, we can just go ahead and import this at the top. You can do this within your text editor, but what we're actually going to do here is we're going to import using package, and we're going to pull in http/http.dart, and we're going to alias this to HTTP, just so it makes it a little bit easier for us to use. So that is now pulled in. we are going to make a request to our API. And there's a little caveat here in that we can't really use localhost 8000. If we just open up the browser on our device here, you can proxy this, but I tend not to for really simple things. Let's go over to this and see what happens. You can see that we don't get anything. The site cannot be reached. Instead, what we need to do is we need to use the proxied URL for this. And this is the following. So 10022 on port 8000. So if I click on that, sure enough, you can see that we get that data there. It's very small, obviously, because we're previewing it on our emulator, but that's the request that we need to make. So let's go ahead and copy this link and just pop that inside of here. That will now successfully make a request to that particular URL, and then we can go ahead and grab the data. Now what we need to do is, in order to actually read this, we need to JSON decode it. So I'm going to go ahead and use the Json Decode method, and we're going to type in the response body like so. Now this will show as a red underline, so we need to import the Dart convert package just at the top here, and that will give us access to that Json decode functionality. Now we've decoded the response body, but really when we fetch the user, what we want to do is take the data inside of here. So because this has returned to us an array, we want to go ahead and pull out the data from this. So what we've now done is created a fetch user method, which returns to us a future. Now, if we think about the data structure of this, inside of this object just here, we've got a string for the value, and then we've got a dynamic value in terms of the Dart data type here. This could be, if we're fetching a list of, say, an ID, an email address, a date, whatever, this is going to be a dynamic value. So a good practice is to type hint this just here. So let's go ahead and say that this is going to be a map, and inside of that map, we're going to have a string for the key and a dynamic value for the value. So I'm just type hinting that in here just to make sure that the data returned from this matches up nicely. Okay, so now we have a method in here, which is returns to us a future. We've got the name as fetch user, and it's an asynchronous method which waits for this request here and then responds with some data. But how do we go ahead and use that inside of here? Well, to do that, we use something called a future builder. You don't need to use a future builder, but this is a really great way to pass in a future, check that the request or check that the snapshot, as we call it, has data, and then we return a component within the future builder. So the future builder itself is a widget. So we're going to go ahead and return or assign to the child of this center a future builder. Two things that we pass to this are the future itself, and we know what our future is. It's the fetch user method. So we're going to go ahead and do this. Then we have a builder property in here, which goes ahead and returns or uses a closure. Inside of this closure, we have our context and we have our snapshot. This is really, really important. So the snapshot of this is, if we just get rid of that arrow function, all of the data that we have, and we can use different properties on this to check if we actually have any data. So let's first of all just use a really simple if statement here to say snapshot has data. So you can see here we've got has error and hash code. We don't need to worry about hash code, but has error and has data. So only if we've got data do we want to return a new widget from this future builder. So we're going to return text, and inside of here we're going to output a string, and we're going to say hey, and then from this what we can do is say snapshot.data and then something like name, like so. Now just before we do this, let's take the snapshot data and let's dump this out to the page. So let's comment this out, and let's go ahead and use debug print, and then in here we're going to say to string. So let's see what happens when this runs, and we get a couple of errors in here just at the moment. That is literally just because we are returning a null from our future builder, from this builder function. Now you can see just down here we've got name Alex. That's been returned to us inside of here, and we can start to use that as we saw over there. So we know that that data is coming through now. So let's go ahead and return this back to how it was. So we're going to say snapshot.data name. Give that a save, and let's just refresh this. And you'll see we get another error, and this is one of the mistakes I first made when I was working with Dart and Flutter. What we're actually seeing here is data is a map with string and dynamic. It's not actually an object that we can access that name getter on. So we have to treat this like a map by using this notation here to pluck out that property. So if I save this, notice that we get Hey Alex. Now, just to demonstrate that this data is dynamic, although it's pretty obvious at this point, I'm just going to head over to the roots that I've defined over on my API, and I'm just going to change the name over to this, and let's head over and refresh this, and we will see that data change to Hey Billy. Now, you will have noticed that when I did refresh this, we got a slight error just before it actually showed that data. Let's just refresh this app again, and you'll see that little flicker there where we had an error. And the reason for this is if we just hover over here, it says this function has a return type of text but doesn't end with a return statement. Now what that means is if the snapshot doesn't have data, so if we don't have data returned from this future, then we are returning nothing down here. So a good thing to do in here is to return something. Well, a sensible thing to do is return something if we don't have data, so we can just kind of fall back on a default here. So let's save this out, give this a refresh. We shouldn't see any errors now to Debug Console, and basically we just see a little flicker here in terms of when that data hasn't yet been returned from this future. So instead what we can actually do is do something like return a circular progress indicator. So let's go ahead and pull that in, and what you'll notice now is a flicker of that circular progress indicator when that data hasn't been loaded, and you can see that just flicker there. And we can simulate this just by going ahead and sleeping within PHP, which is the framework I happen to be using, for 2 seconds. If I refresh this, we'll see a loading indicator for 2 seconds, and then we will see that data. So you can kind of mess around with this in your API just to make sure that the progress indicator is working. So this has been a really simple look at creating a future which goes ahead and makes an HTTP request using that new package that we've pulled in. We've decoded the response from JSON so we can use this as a map, and then we've used a future builder to pass in that future, and then the builder here inside of Snapshot will have properties like has data, which means that we've got that data ready to go, and we can return a new widget from this future builder widget, which subsequently will be rendered to the page. And then we've looked at this fallback circular progress indicator, and that can be anything at all. It can be a piece of text to say it's loading. It can be whatever you want it to be. Now, this kind of API request is great for really small things, but it's not that sustainable. So what we're going to do is head over to the next part, and we're going to look at working with models. So let's say we had a user model. We're probably going to want to assign all of this data to a user model just to tidy this up a little bit. And then as we progress through the course, we'll be looking at building things like a web service, rendering lists of data and all that kind of stuff. So let's jump over to the next part and look at working with models instead.